March 31st, 1967, the Saville Theatre, London. Pete Townshend stood at the edge of the stage, holding his Fender Stratocaster by the neck. The Who had just finished their set. The crowd was screaming. Sweat dripped from his face. His ears were ringing from the volume, the feedback, the controlled chaos that defined their live shows. He lifted the guitar above his head. Then he brought it down hard against the stage floor. Once, twice, 3 times. The neck splintered. The body cracked. Strings snapped and whipped through the air. Wood fragments scattered across the stage. The audience erupted. This was what they came for. The destruction, the spectacle. The violence turned into art. Townshend threw what was left of the guitar toward his amplifier and walked off stage. His hands were shaking, not from fear or regret, but from adrenaline. This was performance. This was making a statement. Guitars were tools, weapons, objects to be used and discarded in service of the moment. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Members of other bands, journalists, hangers-on, all talking about what they'd just witnessed. The Who were revolutionaries. They weren't just playing music. They were destroying it and rebuilding it simultaneously. Townshend grabbed a towel, wiped his face, and sat down on a road case. His bandmates, Roger Daltrey, John Entwistle, and Keith Moon, were scattered around the small backstage area, still buzzing from the performance. A journalist from Melody Maker approached. "Pete, why do you smash your guitars?" Townshend looked up. He'd answered this question 100 times, but he'd answer it again. "Because it's just an instrument. It's a tool. People treat guitars like sacred objects, but they're not. They're pieces of wood and wire. What matters is what you do with them while they're intact, not preserving them afterward." The journalist scribbled notes. Others nearby nodded. This was the ethos. This was the new rock and roll. Destruction as creation. Someone mentioned that Jimi Hendrix was in the building. He'd been watching from the wings. The Who and the Jimi Hendrix Experience were both rising forces in London's rock scene. They'd crossed paths at various venues, respected each other's work from a distance, but hadn't spent much time together. Townshend had seen Jimi play once, maybe twice. Impressive, certainly. Loud, theatrical, technically skilled. But Townshend didn't think much beyond that. Every guitarist in London was trying to be louder, flashier, more outrageous. Jimi fit that mold. Talented, but part of the same game everyone else was playing. The backstage area was crowded. Maybe 30 people packed into a space meant for 15. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Someone had brought bottles of wine. The post-show energy was chaotic, celebratory. Townshend noticed Jimi standing near the far wall, not talking to anyone, just watching. He was wearing a military jacket, colorful scarf, his afro massive even by 1967 standards. He looked out of place, foreign, quiet. Their eyes met across the room. Jimi nodded. Townshend nodded back. A few minutes passed. Townshend was talking to his manager about the next week's schedule when he saw Jimi move. Not toward him, but toward the stage door. Jimi slipped through it, disappearing back toward the performance area. Townshend thought nothing of it. Maybe Jimi wanted to see the stage, check the setup, the usual musician curiosity. 5 minutes later, Jimi returned. He was holding something. Townshend couldn't see what it was at first, but as Jimi walked closer through the crowd, it became clear. It was a piece of Townshend's destroyed guitar. Part of the neck, maybe 8 inches long, splintered at both ends. One string was still attached, hanging loose. Jimi walked up to Townshend and stopped. He didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at the broken piece of wood in his hands, turning it over, examining it like an artifact. "Do you mind?" Jimi asked, his voice quiet, almost shy. "Mind what?" Townshend replied. Jimi held up the guitar fragment. "If I try something with this?" Townshend almost laughed. What could anyone do with a broken piece of wood and 1 string? "Go ahead, mate. It's garbage now anyway." Jimi nodded. He sat down on the floor, cross-legged, in the middle of the backstage area. People were still talking, drinking, laughing, but a few noticed Jimi sitting there with the guitar fragment and started to pay attention. Jimi wrapped the loose string around the splintered wood, tightening it, creating tension. He used a piece of the broken tuning peg that was still attached to adjust the string's pitch. His fingers moved carefully, precisely. The backstage noise began to fade. More people turned to watch. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Townshend stood about 10 feet away, arms crossed, curious but not particularly interested. He just smashed a guitar on stage to make a point about impermanence, about performance over preservation. Now this guy was sitting on the floor trying to make music from the wreckage. Jimmy plucked the string. It made a dull, woody sound. Not musical, just a thud. He adjusted something, tightened the string slightly, plucked again. This time it had pitch, a low note, resonant but imperfect. Then Jimmy started playing. He used the jagged edge of the broken wood to create friction against the string, almost like a bow on a violin. The sound that emerged was haunting, raw, nothing like a normal guitar. It was more like a voice crying, moaning, speaking in a language that had no words. His other hand moved along the string, changing the pitch by pressing down at different points. There were no frets, no reference points, but Jimmy's ear guided him. He found notes, intervals, created a melody from this single vibrating wire. The room went completely silent. Jimmy played for maybe 90 seconds. He didn't showboat. He didn't try to prove anything. He just coaxed music from destruction, found beauty in the broken, transformed what Townshend had discarded into something that resonated. The melody was simple, bluesy, mournful. It sounded ancient and modern simultaneously. It sounded like what might have been played 1,000 years ago and what might be played 1,000 years in the future. He played harmonics by touching the string lightly at different points, creating bell-like tones that seemed impossible from such a crude instrument. He used the splintered edges as percussion, tapping rhythms against the wood while sustaining notes with the string. The fragment became a complete instrument in his hands, not despite its brokenness, but because of it. Someone near the back of the room had tears running down their face. A session guitarist Townshend vaguely recognized. The man wasn't crying from sadness, but from witnessing something he couldn't name. Beauty from wreckage, purpose from waste. Townshend watched Jimmy's face. His eyes were closed. His expression was peaceful, almost meditative. He wasn't performing for the room. He was having a private conversation with the broken piece of wood, and the room was simply overhearing it. The melody changed. What had been mournful became hopeful. The same single string, the same broken fragment, but now it spoke differently. Jimmy's fingers found new positions, new harmonics, and the sound transformed. It was as if the guitar piece was telling its own story, born whole, destroyed violently, and now reborn as something else entirely. Townshend felt his throat tighten. He'd spent years perfecting the art of destruction. He'd calculated the exact angle to swing a guitar for maximum visual impact. He'd studied which parts of the stage would shatter instruments most dramatically. He'd turned breaking things into a science. And here was Jimmy, turning his science into irrelevance. Around the room, other musicians watched with expressions Townshend recognized. Eric Clapton was there, standing near the corner. His face had gone pale. Jeff Beck, leaning against the wall, had stopped mid-conversation. Even Keith Moon, the Who's drummer, known for destroying drum kits with the same abandon Townshend brought to guitars, had gone quiet. When Jimmy stopped, he gently set the guitar fragment down on the floor. He looked up at Townshend and said, "Thank you for letting me try." Nobody clapped. Nobody said anything. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. The kind of silence that happens when something profound has occurred and nobody wants to be the first to break it. Townshend felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not jealousy, but a kind of vertigo. Like the ground had moved beneath him. He'd just spent an entire performance destroying a guitar to make a statement about art being more important than objects. And Jimmy had taken that destruction and created something more meaningful than anything Townshend had played all night. Townshend walked over to where Jimmy sat. He picked up the guitar fragment, looked at it, felt its weight. "How did you do that?" Jimmy shrugged. "Just listen to what it wanted to say. It's a broken piece of wood." "Everything makes sound if you listen," Jimmy said simply. "Broken things sometimes make the most interesting sounds." Townshend sat down next to him. The backstage crowd was still watching, but the two guitarists seemed unaware of the audience. "I smashed that guitar to make a point," Townshend said quietly, "that it's just an object, that the performance matters more than the instrument." "You're right," Jimi replied. "It is just an object, but it's also not. It was part of your performance. Now it's part of something else." Townshend didn't know how to respond. He'd built his entire stage persona around destruction, around the idea that guitars were disposable tools. And here was someone showing him that even in destruction, there was still potential, still voice, still music waiting to be found. "You made me look like an idiot," Townshend said, but there was no malice in his voice, just honesty. "I didn't mean to," Jimi said. "I just saw a piece of wood with a string and wondered what sound it would make." The party resumed around them, but neither musician moved. They sat there for a while, not talking, just existing in the aftermath of what had happened. Eventually, Jimi stood up, carefully picking up the guitar fragment. "Can I keep this?" "It's yours," Townshend said. "You gave it more life in 90 seconds than I gave it all night." Jimi nodded and quietly left the backstage area. Townshend remained sitting on the floor. His bandmate Roger Daltrey walked over. "You all right?" "Yeah," Townshend said, but he wasn't sure if that was true. That night, back at his flat in Belgravia, Townshend couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The sound of that single string, the way Jimi's fingers had moved with such certainty across an instrument that didn't exist 5 minutes before he started playing it. Townshend got out of bed, picked up one of his guitars, and sat in the dark. He played for a while, but everything sounded hollow. Not technically wrong, just empty. Like he'd been playing the right notes in the wrong language his entire career. He thought about the dozens of guitars he'd destroyed over the past year. Each one had been a statement, a performance, a moment. But what if they'd also been voices he'd silenced? What if each smashed instrument had music left in it that he'd never bothered to hear? He remembered a conversation he'd had with his father months earlier. His father had been a musician too, a saxophonist in dance bands during the war. He'd told young Pete that instruments weren't just objects, they were partners. You took care of them, and they took care of you. Townshend had dismissed that as old-fashioned sentimentality. He was part of the new generation. They didn't coddle their instruments. They used them, pushed them, destroyed them. That was the point. That was the revolution. But watching Jimi play that fragment, Townshend wondered if his father had understood something he'd been too arrogant to see. Maybe instruments did have voices. Maybe they did deserve to be heard, not just used and discarded. The next few weeks were strange for Townshend. He continued performing with The Who. He continued smashing guitars. But something had changed. The act felt different, less profound, more performative in the shallow sense. He couldn't stop thinking about what Jimi had done. It wasn't about technical skill, though clearly Jimi had that. It was about listening, about finding music in places others declared empty. Townshend had declared the smashed guitar empty, finished, purposeless. Jimi had proven him wrong without saying a word. In interviews over the following months, journalists would ask Townshend about his guitar destruction. His answers became less confident, more contemplative. He started adding caveats. "It's theater," he'd say, "but theater with meaning, I hope." The Who continued to evolve. Their music became more complex, more thoughtful. Townshend started writing songs that explored deeper themes, questions about identity, purpose, the meaning behind the spectacle. In 1969, he wrote Tommy, a rock opera that asked fundamental questions about communication, perception, and what it means to truly hear and be heard. Critics noted that Townshend's work had matured, become less about destruction and more about creation. When Jimi died in September 1970, Townshend was devastated. He didn't speak publicly about it immediately, but years later, in a 1987 interview with Rolling Stone, he finally told the story of that night backstage. "I smashed my guitar to make a statement," Townshend said. "Jimi picked up the pieces and made music. That tells you everything about the difference between us. I was about destruction. He was about creation. Even when all he had was a broken piece of wood, he found music in it." The interviewer asked if that moment changed him. Absolutely, Townshend replied. I realized that night that destruction without purpose is just noise, and creation can happen anywhere, even in the wreckage. Jimmy taught me that. He didn't mean to, but he did. Do you still smash guitars? Townshend smiled sadly. Sometimes, but now when I do it, I remember that even broken things can sing. Jimmy showed me that. He picked up something I'd thrown away and showed me I hadn't really understood what I destroyed. He paused, looking out the window of the studio where the interview was being conducted. You know what haunts me? I wonder how many voices I silenced over the years. How many guitars I smashed that had music left in them. Jimmy heard music in a fragment. I'd been destroying whole instruments and calling it art. The interviewer pressed further. But your destruction was art. It became iconic. It defined rock performance. Maybe, Townshend said. But Jimmy showed me there's a difference between destroying to make a point and creating despite destruction. One is a statement. The other is truth. I was making statements. Jimmy was revealing truth. The guitar fragment that Jimmy took from that backstage area was never seen again. Some say he kept it. Some say he used it in a recording session, its haunting sound buried somewhere in one of his tracks. Some say it was lost. But people who were there that night remembered. They told the story to other musicians, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. The night Pete Townshend smashed his guitar and Jimi Hendrix made it sing. It became a lesson about art, about ego, about the difference between destruction and creation. Townshend had destroyed to make a point. Jimmy had created to make music. One was a statement, the other was truth. Years later, when asked what he learned from Jimi Hendrix, Townshend would say that breaking something doesn't mean it's finished, that music exists even in fragments, that listening is more important than performing. That genius isn't about how loud you can be or how dramatically you can destroy. It's about hearing what others miss and bringing it to life. The Who continued to smash instruments on stage for years. It became their signature. But after that night in March 1967, it meant something different to Pete Townshend. It wasn't just theater anymore. It was a reminder that even in destruction, there's potential. Even in broken pieces, there's song. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it.